Welcome, everyone, to the Babylon Cast. Today we're joined by Jonathan Rauch. Rauch is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's the author of 9 books, with his 2 most recent being Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, and The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. This is a conversation that I've been pretty excited for. I've been a big fan of Jonathan for some time, as he's one of the few voices from those who were critical of the illiberal left, it seems, that are also being critical of the illiberal right, which is pretty much all of MAGA. And by liberal, we of course mean not progressivism, but rather the founding values upon which the United States was founded upon, values that are completely absent from the MAGA crowd. Anyways, we go over the Constitution of Knowledge, the reality-based community, liberalism and its limitations, religious pluralism, and more. Anyways, hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome, everyone, to the Babylon Cast. As always, I'm your host, Vern. I'm accompanied by my good friend and co-host, Bruce. Bruce, how are you doing today?
I am very well. I'm very looking forward. I'm very much looking forward to today's guest and the conversation we're about to have.
That's right. Today we're joined by the lovely and ever-esteemed Mr. Jonathan Rauch. Rauch is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute up in Washington. He's the author of 9 books, with his most recent being Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, whose topics will no doubt come up. And he's also the author of The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, another book that no doubt I'm sure will be coming up, or at least their ideas. And he's also a contributing writer at The Atlantic and the recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award. Mr. Rauch, it's such a pleasure to have you here.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure you've gotten this question a million times, so I apologize for coming off as redundant, but we should probably just get some preliminary housekeeping out of the way. One of the concepts that you talk about and that you discussed in your, not your most recent book, but the one before that, The Constitution of Knowledge, is the concept of the reality-based community and the Constitution of Knowledge. Would you mind just kind of giving a brief synopsis of what those two ideas are?
Sure, I'll do my best. Brevity is not the easiest thing with such big topics, but here goes. So every society has to figure out how to adjudicate disputes about truth and separate fact from opinion. And humans historically have done that by separating into tribes and then relying on texts or priests or princes or parties to dictate what's true. And that tends to lead to schism and violence and oppression. And you find out who's right because the person who's wrong gets thrown in jail, exiled, or killed. Constitution of Knowledge put an end to all that. Starts around 350 years ago, in the time of Galileo and Locke and Francis Bacon and others. And that sets out rules for figuring out who's right and who's wrong about reality. And those rules turn out, when you look at them, to have a lot in common with the U.S. Constitution, because they set in place a systems of checks and balances where no one can make knowledge by themselves and no one can make knowledge by violating other people's ability to make knowledge. So you've got to persuade. It's like compromise in the U.S. Constitution. And you've got a lot of people and a lot of different factions, and that's the diversity that makes it possible to reach truth. And so that's the Constitution of Knowledge. It's not a figure of speech or a simile or a metaphor like the marketplace of ideas. It's a real thing. It's not written down in just one place, but you'll find it in places like the News Guild's ethics codes for journalists and the AAUP, American Association of University Professors, Red Book on academic freedom and proper academic procedure, and the rules for the bar, legal rules, and medical protocols, and all the other places that have to set down the ways. What are the rules going to be for running experiments and trials and figuring out what's true and what's false? And the Constitution of Knowledge is what's made it possible to have the science that we have. That brings me to the reality-based community, which you asked about. And those are the people who professionally are in the business of making reality. And they're the people who adhere to the Constitution of Knowledge, who protect it, who spend years and years learning its rules. The big four, there's lots of people in the reality-based community. You know, it's got museums and libraries and certain types of consultants. But the big four are number one, first and most important, academia, science, and the research establishment. That's the mainstay. The second is journalism, which is my field. And these are the rules that tell us how to distinguish fact from fiction. The third is the law. People don't know this. I didn't know this till I researched this book. But the idea of a fact does not come out of science. It comes out of law, because medieval courts needed to have an account of facts in order to decide how to come to rulings. Like, so who does the donkey actually belong to? It's a fact-based profession, and it's a fact-finding profession. That's what juries do. And the fourth is administrative law and government. Government cannot just make up stuff about you in order to put you in jail. It has to be fact-based. The U.S. government and all the state governments are just heavily, heavily shot through with rules and institutions that keep them grounded in facts and prevent them from making stuff up. And you see what happens when government can make stuff up, decide to levy charges against you with no justification and deport you to a jail in El Salvador. That's called tyranny. So those four are the big elements of the reality-based community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. It's funny because I was going to ask you a question. I remember hearing you on, I think it was the Waking Up podcast, that you said that if a government and its institutions stop being fact-based, it starts being tyrannical. So I was going to ask you if we're there yet.
We're on the way. Yeah, we're definitely on the way. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We have a government that makes stuff up and uses it as the basis for legal proceedings, and that's a tyrannical move. We're far from all the way there, though. We'll see. The courts are not accepting this so far.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I'm glad that the courts are pushing back, and I'm glad that at least it seems like the general public opinion is changing, because I remember when Trump won in November 6th, it was probably one of the strangest days of my life, because I could have sworn it was going to go down Kamala Harris, and I had to check, well, what am I getting wrong about society? Because I had thought that the tide was turning, and maybe I'm wrong now, but it seems like based on polls, Trump's popularity is at an all-time low, only beaten by Elon Musk. So we'll see what the future holds in store for us. But that's a good example right there of what happens when a government or an institution doesn't abide by the constitution of knowledge, or they stop being fact-based, they stop being reality-based. You see it manifest itself so dangerously and pestilentially within politics. What would you say would be the way in which it manifests itself on the other side, just to try to be a little bit fair, even though both me and Bruce are on board, and we think you are as well, that one side is a lot more concerning than the other, but just also for the sake of making sure that all the bases are being touched, what would you say is the way it manifests itself coming from the other side?
Well, my book, Constitution of Knowledge, I actually devote more space and energy and concern to the left-wing aspects of this than the right-wing, because when that book was published, it was the very beginning of Joe Biden's presidency. And I thought, well, Donald Trump is out of office. The MAGA movement is struggling. Their attack on truth and reality has failed. So I'm going to focus more on the ongoing attack, which is, some people have called it woke. Others have called it cancel culture. But the big idea there is that you can use social pressure, social coercion of various types, and different types of sort of postmodernist ideas to manipulate truth. So that, in fact, there is no truth, there's only power. And you saw that both in principle in the postmodernist movement, which says exactly that. But you would see it in environments, especially like campuses, but also in social media, where small groups of people who tend to be extreme are able to manipulate what looks to be true, or what looks like majority opinion, by being more organized and noisy than anyone else. So you could have whole campuses where majorities of people did not buy into the so-called woke progressive agenda, but people are silent about it, except the very noisy people who are for it and who will punish you in different ways socially and by investigating you and so on if you dissent. And that's a classic way of manipulating public opinion, to create the appearance that is a false majority. People say, well, so most people are against me, so I'll shut up. And that's what canceling does. It's a very sophisticated form of cognitive warfare.
John, we got to meet in person at the Censorship and the Sciences conference a few months ago. I don't know how you felt about it, but I left with incredibly mixed feelings about the event, and the circumstances in the months since then, they haven't helped matters. What I'm about to ask ties in very, very closely to what you and Vern were just talking about. I've been very, very concerned about the illiberalism on the left for many, many years now, and that concern was further fueled when I constantly saw a lack of knowledge of fundamental liberal concepts and values, including but not limited to free speech, institutional knowledge, separation of church and state, and so on. And I thought that the with all the problems with the woke left, given what was at stake, the fundamental reason to push back was to preserve these values. But fast forward to this current administration and the circumstances surrounding it, and I'm seeing the excuses from the opposition on the right to curtail free expression, this historical revisionism to suit the other side's narrative, just like the woke. There's all this other sort of nonsense that's just occurring. Now, we heard people say at the conference some, in my opinion, some incredibly asinine things like we have to become our own experts. Or and what I've been seeing run around is that there's the infamous quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes: "You can't shout fire in a crowded theater to selectively support and to selectively cancel certain forms of speech." When this whole phenomenon, when I noticed this whole phenomenon started happening, I spent a lot of time educating myself on why we have the rules and parameters we have in place to ensure a liberal government. But I've also convinced myself that no one really understands liberalism and only selectively supports liberal values when it suits their needs. I'll bet my next month's paycheck I can pull a random person off the street outside, and they won't be able to define liberalism in the overall philosophical context. I wanted to ask your perspective on this and how well liberal values are truly understood. Am I just being incredibly cynical, or do you find in your conversations that there is actually a greater understanding of liberal values?
Well, we're in the process of finding out. They so I, if we have time to circle back to it, Bruce, I'd be interested to hear more about your reactions to the conference and what you found dispiriting. I noticed, as maybe you did, a pretty sharp distinction between the academics, who made a lot of very good arguments and points, and the non-academics, who tend to be attracted to conferences about politicization of science and who had some fairly screwy ideas. So maybe that's what you're getting at, but I'd love to hear your perspective. So what we mean here by liberalism, just to clarify, is not modern American style progressivism of the left. We're using it in the old sense, the European sense of classical liberalism. And when I use it that way, I mean that the system and ideas of the founders of the country, which are processes that are based in individual and minority rights, the rule of law, democracy, science and empiricism, and free markets. So that's actually more associated with conservatism in the United States than with progressivism. But I think that's what we're talking about. And I think liberalism was a victim of its own long-term success, which is it worked so well for so long that by around 1990, a lot of us, Frank Fukuyama, but I too thought, well, there's no other system left. We're all liberals now. This is the destiny of the world. And we kind of forgot that liberalism is the most counterintuitive social idea ever. We forgot to defend it. We forgot to teach it. And it got taken for granted. Of course, a lot of people are unhappy with a lot of things that are going on in the world. And it's pretty easy to blame liberalism for those things because it's the system that's kind of in charge. And we can talk and maybe should talk about those critiques and what's right about them and what's wrong about them. But the end of the story is that liberalism gets blamed for a lot of things that are not its fault and some things that are its fault. And we stop teaching it. So a lot of Americans don't even understand it. They don't know much civics. So we're faced now with a crisis, a current crisis of an illiberal administration that's violating liberal laws and norms left and right. If we get through that as a liberal democracy, which is open to question, then we've got a generation's worth of work to do, maybe 2 generations of going back to teaching these basics.
That's quite a daunting task in and out of itself.
Yeah, the I think one of the scariest things that has happened within the past couple of years is just the complete distrust of these institutions. Whether we're talking about the medical establishment or the field of journalism, as you were saying earlier, that people are no longer trusting this and they're increasingly trusting new media. Instead of listening to what the CDC has to say about COVID or about the current state of medicine, they'll start listening to who was the most recent provocateur on Joe Rogan, or they'll start listening to some third party agencies that probably shouldn't really be in the business of determining what is best in terms of medicine. We now have RFK Jr. up in the high auspices of dealing with this sort of thing. And so, and to some extent, I can empathize and understand why that happened, right? Institutions do get things wrong from time to time. It happens. The CDC, after all, initially said that masks weren't effective, and then they were. But however, I can't imagine to believe that new media is somehow a reliable alternative. Like if we place the CDC's track record next to RFK Jr.'s track record or Joe Rogan's track record, I mean, the CDC runs laps around them. It's not even up for debate. But them being wrong, an institution like the CDC being wrong or the New York Times being wrong, it's clearly more consequential than Joe Rogan being wrong, or at least it should be more consequential because they should be held to a higher standard, right? It matters more that the CDC gets something wrong than it does if your local crazy uncle at the Thanksgiving table gets something wrong. But if someone like Joe Rogan has a comparable amount of influence as the CDC does, right? If enough people listen to Joe Rogan, I mean, he can change voting patterns. He can change behavior patterns among a large population of people because they trust him. I mean, shouldn't new media also be held to a higher standard? I remember watching this clip the other day of, I don't mean to name drop, but Charlie Kirk on Bill Maher. And Charlie Kirk was going over what Doge had allegedly uncovered with all these government programs that are just being wasteful. And he brought up the idea that we were spending money on transgender mice. Now, the reality is that we're not. It's transgenic mice. And after Bill Maher corrected him, Charlie Kirk said, "Oh, maybe I got something wrong. I have to look at it again." Which the cynic in me is thinking, "Oh, you absolutely knew that it was transgenic mice, but you just wanted to make it seem like it wasn't." And so I'll watch examples like this, and I'll think, for one, Charlie Kirk has a lot more reach, I would imagine. Joe Rogan certainly has a much larger reach than the New York Times, but people don't really seem to care when they get something like this wrong. And I don't know how to fix the trust in our conventional institutions that on average perform much better because they do have these checks and balances within them versus new media. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we can transfer the trust from new media into the institutions again, because it seems like an unsolvable problem to me.
Well, a lot to say about that, Vern. If you don't want to go here, that's fine. But I would be curious your approximate age and what you rely on for news and information. You look like you may be in your 20s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm currently 28.
Yeah, so that's right. The target generation that I try to ask this question of. I'll come to your point in a minute. But where do you turn primarily for your primary sources of what you think is reliable information?
What I usually do is I'll have there's this website called Real Clear Politics that kind of takes you to a bunch of different other websites and articles. And I use this extension plugin called Ground News that tells you whether or not a story was reported overwhelmingly by this side or the other side. And I use that to get a general idea of just general domestic issues going on in the country. When it comes to like medical things, like for example during COVID, generally I trusted the CDC. I trusted the group of people that I knew were getting their information by either peer reviewing each other or building upon the knowledge of the people previously within that field. I generally tried to listen to the experts that I think I had good reason to believe that they were more likely to get the answer correct than just your average podcaster.
So that's interesting. So primarily print sources or written sources. You're not getting a lot of news from Instagram, TikTok, etc.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm barely on social media. Yeah.
Um, and it sounds like the print sources that you're relying on are pretty mainstream. Most of what, not all, but most of what Real Clear links to is fairly mainstream stuff.
Yeah, by and large, mainstream stuff. Yeah.
Um, and it sounds like you're also going to institutions that have some traditional credibility, at least. You know, places like CDC and NIH, for example, and so forth. So does that make you unusual in your generation?
Um, in general, yes. Probably on average, people my age would be getting their news from headlines and such. Within the group of people that also are interested in talking about politics and philosophy online, probably not too unusual. I guess it just depends on whether or not we're counting everyone my age or only the people who care about this type of stuff my age. But overall, on average, probably yeah, social media.
Yeah, well, your information habits suggest that there are at least a number of people your generation who are relying on mainstream sources that are fact checked, that will run corrections, that are careful about their sources, and so forth. And that's encouraging to me because we're always reading that nobody your age is doing anything but social media for news. And when I ask classes at universities where they're getting news, TikTok, well, this is actually 3 years out of date now, but they were saying that TikTok was the number one source, which made me despair. So, but what you say gives me hope, and I'm hearing more of that recently. And so I'll give you a narrow response and then a broader response if you have time for both. So the narrow response is that building trust in information institutions, that's science and it's the media predominantly, also universities, does not have a single generic answer. It requires the people within those institutions to do a conscientious assessment of why are we losing trust, what have we done wrong, and how can we do better. And I constantly tell people in speeches who ask me what to do, I say, don't ask me. You're in a reality-based institution. Often they're academics. Sometimes they're journalists. Sometimes they're lawyers, but they're all in this world. And I say, if you sit down with a pad and a pencil for 1 hour, I believe that you can come up with 3 things that you can do in your own institution where you work or where you invest your capital to strengthen the values of the Constitution of Knowledge in that community. It might be if you're a university deciding to work to bring in the Chicago principles or institutional neutrality. It might be if you're just a member of a faculty at a faculty meeting or at a hiring committee saying, are we sure we're considering viewpoint diversity here? We don't all want to have the same view in this department. If you're a journalist, it's looking for sources that you might not have considered. There's just all kinds of ways to do it, and it's not a big top-down thing. It's millions and millions of people doing things to strengthen their own institutions. That work is difficult. My assessment is that law has really done a very good job of protecting its values. The courts are not allowing a lot of bullshitting. The MAGA Trump forces brought 61 lawsuits against the 2020 election, all of them bullshit. All but one were thrown out, and the exception was they got a little bit of relief on a technical question. But the courts just aren't having it. The government is in more danger because it's now in the hands of people who are in many cases anti-truth. We're going to see that, for example, at HHS and what they're going to say about vaccines and autism. The Secretary of Health and Human Services has promised in September, I think, to finally answer the question of vaccines and autism. That's ominous because the question about vaccines and autism was answered decades ago. There is no connection. So we're in trouble there. Mainstream media has a problem with viewpoint diversity, but it's actually worked on that. Trump came as a shock. The bigger problem is economic. It's very expensive to do fact-based news. You have to go out and find stuff out, and then you have to check it, and then you have to go to the sources that you're talking about, the people you're talking about and asking for comment, and you're liable for libel judgments, and You need to have lawyers and staffs and newsrooms. You don't need any of that to make stuff up. You can do that with an algorithm and ChatGPT sitting on your sofa. And no one's paying the bills for that. So that's become a crisis. And that's something I don't have an answer to. But I think the economic crisis is a bigger problem in news media than the bias crisis. And then you have the institution that's most important and running the furthest behind, in my opinion, and that's academia. And that's the subject of the conference that Bruce and I and others attended, where there are disciplines and departments which have lost their grip on viewpoint diversity, which have become orthodox and sometimes are given over to politics. And universities have lost massive amounts of trust in the last 10 years. The trust levels dropped by, I think it's 12 percentage points. Huge drop. And that's because people don't perceive them as being on the level. And now they're paying the price in the form of the attack on them from the government that we're seeing. I'm a member of the board of Heterodox Academy, which is one of a number of organizations that are now working on this problem. And the good news is that partly because of the shock of what the Trump administration is doing, there's been a wake-up call that universities need to get serious about removing the politics from the curriculum, about getting rid of the DEI statements, about institutional neutrality, about freedom of speech, viewpoint diversity, the things that we've been talking about for a long time. So I think now we may have a better shot at reform. So those are my hopes. It's no one big answer, though. I'll tell you I mentioned I'd filibuster for a bit and that there's a narrow answer and a broad answer. If you're not out of patience with me, do you want the broad answer? Okay. I'm conscious of going on for too long. So here's the broad answer. When you're in the midst of one of these epistemic or information crises like we have right now, everything seems hopeless because the media world is turned upside down. No one has a handle on it. The gatekeepers are gone. The most unreliable people are getting the most traction. The algorithms are putting crazy stuff in front of our eyes all the time. You just don't even know where to start. But we've been here before. This is not the first epistemic crisis. They always cause upheaval. They can have very bad results. The printing press was the first and still the worst. It led to 150 years of war across Europe. There was a big crisis in the United States in the late 19th century in the news business, which had descended into a sewer of hyperpartisanship and fake news. In the latter case, that was sorted out over a period of a couple of generations through the development of journalistic ethics, journalism schools, journalism prizes, professionalized newsrooms, turning it into a profession with professional standards. And the reason that worked is it turns out that being reality-based is good for business. I mean, at the end of the day, I guess maybe it's fun for some people to believe that Hillary Clinton ran a sex trafficking ring from the non-existent basement of a pizzeria in Washington. But over time, people tend to discover that believing fake stuff is not good for you. It's not good for your portfolio, your emotional well-being, or just staying in touch with reality. There is only one proven system in all of the annals of 200,000 years of human history that is reliably good at keeping a society anchored to reality and moving it closer to truth. And that's the constitution of knowledge. Nothing else works. And that means that these guys who are saying all kinds of bogus stuff, for example, I don't know, that Ukraine started the war with Russia, that vaccines don't work. You can do that for only so long before you run into the brick wall known as reality. The facts are just otherwise. They're actually there. So they suffer under the huge disadvantage of believing their own bullshit and getting lost on cloud nine. People don't like a toxic epistemic environment where they don't know what's true or what they can trust. They hate that. And it is the constitution of knowledge and all of the institutions and norms and rules that go with it that offer them some epistemic safety, some assurance. Of course, mistakes will be made. The whole point of science isn't that it doesn't make mistakes. It's that it makes them very quickly, and it finds them quickly, and it rejects them quickly. But it does make mistakes, and it does disappoint us. But it also does correct its mistakes And as it corrects mistakes, it moves closer to reality, as we saw with COVID, as we're still seeing with COVID. It's the only system that can design a vaccine for a brand new virus over the course of a weekend. That can analyze the virus, find its genome in the course of a weekend, and then design a vaccine 2 weeks later over the course of another weekend, using an international network of researchers and institutions that in real time mobilize billions of dollars in equipment, endless years of professional training, and labs and groups all over the world. Nothing even approaches that. And that means that our side, my side at least, the Constitution of Knowledge, the reality-based community, has the huge inherent advantages of working to improve people's lives and to keep people real. We have that huge advantage, and we must not forget that and get dispirited.
I think, John, that we're actually all on the same side in that regard. There, I have a question for you on that on those lines. Are you familiar with any of Yuval Noah Harari's work?
Familiar, yeah. I haven't read it cover to cover, but
one of his books, I think it was Homo Deus, his second volume. He's very skeptical on whether a liberal democracy is going to survive the 21st century because of for the example, the proliferation of AI and some of the social technology that China is using to exert authoritarianism. We're talking about a corrupted information landscape here in the States, and China is obviously a big player on the international stage. One of the striking aspects of your book, and one of my favorite chapters, is when you wrote on James Madison's contribution to the American Constitution, his idea of using ambition to counter ambition. A liberal democracy is designed along the parameters of the United States, is built with intentional deadlocks. Each segment of the trifecta is able to cancel the other, forcing people to work together towards common goals. But implicit in this design is that there is a healthy marketplace of ideas. We see recently how people like Joe Rogan, can platform people who are absolute quacks. And we also see how experts are now looked upon, not entirely unfairly, very poorly. In one of Sam Harris's recent podcasts, he makes a very persuasive argument that we are still heavily reliant on experts and, by extension, the Constitution of Knowledge for accurate information. But the current environment, one could make the argument that it's not salubrious. Can a liberal democracy still function in a landscape in which the marketplace has arguably been corrupted? Are we just, or because of the constraints of the 21st century and its technology, or are we just moving into extremely unknown territory here?
Well, we are in unknown territory. To repeat what I said a minute ago, this is not the first time that we've entered new territory that was deeply confusing in terms of information sources, information revolutions, and they're consequential. And some of those consequences can be really bad, like, the end of liberal democracy in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, which was to some extent driven by the rise of radio, a new medium that was, very disruptive. So yeah, Bruce, no guarantees. This is terra incognita, and I am not in the school that says inevitably the good guys win. What's most challenging and threatening right at the moment, in my opinion, is not the media crisis, though that is a big, big challenge. Don't get me wrong. It's the government crisis. It's the fact that you now have a United States government which is not anchored in the Constitution of Knowledge, which feels at liberty to make stuff up. We had a vice presidential candidate who, when it was pointed out to him that the people of a town in, is it Illinois, Ohio, were not eating cats and dogs, said, Springfield, Ohio, thank you, said, well, that particular story might not be exactly true, but it's true. Basically, it's the kind of thing, it's the kind of story that we tell to help people understand our point of view. I can't remember what he said, but he basically said it doesn't have to be true that we're accusing people in a particular town, immigrants, of eating cats and dogs. This ought to shock our consciences if we care about truth and the Constitution of Knowledge. We now have federal agencies who it's going to be very unclear if they're anchored to truth. We're going to find out. But as I said, the signs are ominous from the Department of Health and Human Services. The signs are ominous from the Justice Department and ICE, which is deporting people on charges that seem to be false and are not apologizing for that. They're not saying, oh, darn, we made a mistake, let's correct it. They're doubling down. They're adding more false charges. We've got a president who just the other day showed a photo of what he claimed were mass graves, proving the existence of genocide against whites in South Africa. If he had bothered to check, he would have found out that, as I understand it, was not mass graves. It was a roadside piece of kind of art. It was a protest art. And so that's an absolutely huge challenge, and not one that we have faced before. A government that is unmoored from reality and in many ways at war with reality. And I'd be kidding you guys if I didn't say that I'm worried sick about it.
Yeah, it's concerning because I don't know how to. I agree with you. It seems like we have a government that doesn't really care about truth. And the people who are very staunch adherents of that movement, the MAGA movement, they also don't really seem to care about truth either. It seems like a lot of the times they'll make an argument, but that argument is just a proxy for a bigger narrative, right? So, for example, they'll claim that they care about like children. They don't want children being groomed, and because they care about children very deeply, but yet for some reason they only care about children in instances of drag queen story hour, but not when it comes to gun violence. They claim to care about election integrity, right? With the reason why we want to implement these measures is because we want to make sure that elections are accurate and that they are reliable and that they are not corrupt and they're not being no one's trying to steal the election. But then when it comes out that Donald Trump and his team hired people to pose as fake slates of electors, they don't really care about that. That's actually not a big deal. So it seems like people don't appear to be communicating their desires very accurately or honestly, and that truth isn't as important to them, so much so as it is just making arguments in defense of their ideology or of their overall just belief system. And so with these sorts of people who are the government really acting exactly the same way, how have you managed to try to communicate with these types of people when you aren't fully sure if they even care that much about truth? I mean, how do we even communicate with that type of person?
Well, the Constitution of Knowledge is a set of professional norms and ethics, and it's really aimed at the professional class of people who are truth seekers for a living. And those are the people that we talked about earlier. Ordinary people on the street are mostly not involved in those professions. They're doing childcare or nursing or fixing your car or putting a gutter on your roof. And our country, our republic, does not rely on every individual person in every walk of life having a kind of scientist understanding of how you pursue truth. That's not their job. So you need a society that is truth friendly, but not necessarily all of society that is truth seeking. What is important, the crucial thing, this goes back to the point that you guys were making earlier, is you need a society where ordinary people going on about their lives have enough basic trust in the people who are professional truth seekers so that they can feel they can get on with their lives and follow the general consensus of experts. So the level that I look at is exactly the level that we talked about 5 minutes ago, which is how do we restore increased trust in these institutions? And how do we reform them and improve them to gain more of that trust? And also, how do we do a much better job of educating people on what these institutions are doing? As I said, we took liberalism for granted. We forgot to educate people in it. We forgot that liberalism is, as I mentioned earlier, it's the most counterintuitive social idea of all time. Like, take free speech. The idea that speech that is offensive, wrongheaded, blasphemous, bigoted should not only be allowed by the government, but protected by the government, that's completely crazy. No society's ever allowed that idea. And the only saving grace of that nutty idea is it's the most single successful social idea of all time. Because you can't have science and you can't have modernity without it. But trusting markets to make decisions, these, impersonal actors, trusting prices to give you accurate information, trusting an electorate, all these disembodied people in voting, and you get so little actual say to make decent decisions about the future of the republic, trusting your representatives when they get there. Liberal systems are absolutely dependent on huge amounts of trust in strangers. That's what they have in common, and that's what we.
I remember speaking to the ex-Muslim activist Yasmin Mohammed about liberalism, and one of the things she mentioned all those years back was that she was concerned that liberalism doesn't have a hard stopping point. And what liberalism ultimately is, it's a political philosophy that allows for people of diverse ideological lines to coexist in peace. But that doesn't presume that everyone who lives within the liberal sphere adhere. Well, actually, that's my question. It's like, doesn't that presume that everyone who lives within the liberal sphere adhere to a strict objective value of live and let live? We see the genesis of liberalism's ideas come from John Locke, and in which he states that there comes a time in which diverse peoples they need to adjudicate their differences, but we surrender our ability to do so to a governing body, a la Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. And though the outlining of our rights changes as our understanding of human nature grows, examples include slavery is wrong, homosexuality is absolutely normal, and it's not unethical, and all that stuff comes over time as we understand human nature and the world around us more. But the core principle is the one I just mentioned is the one that's just seems to be unviable in classical liberalism. Just live and let live. Is this the hard stopping point of liberalism? Is this the one that everyone in a liberal democracy must adhere to, no matter what ideological strip they come from?
No,
No.
I think that's a misconception. Part of the complaint that so-called post-liberals have about liberalism is they think it's just live and let live, it's value neutral, and it's about maximum freedom and autonomy for individuals at the expense of family, faith, tradition, and country, and therefore it completely dissolves itself into a mass of individualism that then in turn becomes authoritarianism when it falls apart. And that, I think, is a fundamental misunderstanding of liberalism, which is not based in live and let live. It's based in observing the rights of others. That is to say, we all have basic rights, and we constrain ourselves to observe those rights in others, even when we don't feel like it. In other words, liberalism is not first and foremost about the freedom to do whatever I want. The first thing it requires is that I constrain myself not to invade your rights. That's where Locke begins. His notion of rights is different from Hobbes fundamentally. He also preserves a right of revolution, unlike Hobbes. So he says you don't give the government complete and absolute power at any point. If it intrudes on your rights, you have to get rid of it. That's the foundation of liberalism. It is all about self-restraint. People don't understand that self-restraint is really difficult, but that's why Franklin famously said, when asked by a passerby what the Constitution had created, he said, a republic, if you can keep it. The founders told us again and again, this is going to be really difficult. Observing these laws and these rules in the Constitution and then subsequently the Bill of Rights is very, very demanding. Madison said, a republic, a democratic republic, is the most demanding form of government because it requires the largest amount of virtue in the citizenry. That's in the Federalist. Washington's last farewell address talked about the importance of virtue. They all did. And what they were trying to tell us is this is not anything goes, live and let live. This is a rigorous system with lots of rules and constraints that we have to learn and observe.
See, thank you.
Yeah. Do you feel
I
like
see a puzzled expression, Bruce?
It's not so much a puzzled expression, so much as there's a lot there, and maybe I should back up a little bit about what I meant by saying live and live. I didn't mean everyone is free to go off and do a free for all. But they're living in a liberal democracy means there are a set a core a set of core values that we have to adhere to. It doesn't mean that we dissolve into anarchy, but um, the idea that we have when the Constitution was established, there was a lot of resistance to it because they felt that everyone's rights would be constrained under too strong a central government. That's why we have a Bill of Rights to outline the rights of the individual. That was inviolable by government. So there is a certain freedom of movement there, but what it all comes down to is that there are certain core constraints.
Yes. So there are certain core constraints. One thing that is not true is that liberalism is a valueless, neutral structure that has no content. That is far from true. There's lots of Republican virtues, the virtues of liberalism that the founders told us we have to have. There are things like lawfulness. You've got to follow the law, even if you don't agree with it. Truthfulness, civility, toleration, pluralism. These are all, and there are others. These are all core virtues that a liberal society needs in order to survive. And in the most recent book I wrote is about the founders, the framers, Tocqueville, all the way back to Locke. The liberals all told us that just the liberal rules by themselves don't give you those values. They have to come from civil society, including faith, for example, and family and community and schools. And they warned us that it's not enough just to have a constitution and some laws. You have to have the substrate of values in society that helps people understand why it's important to obey the laws and where the principles of the Constitution come from. The ultimate principle, I think the best short definition of liberalism, and it is far from value neutral, is the proposition that all humans are born free and equal. That's a very radical proposition by the standards of human history, in which people are typically born into hierarchies, not free and not equal. But there it is in the Declaration of Independence, and that is far from value neutral.
Do you feel like there might be some level of tension, some concerning tension between religion and faith and the liberal project at large? Because one of the things that I've been grappling with, and you mentioned in your book, The Constitution of Knowledge, about how the reality based community isn't the only community that exists. You know, you have faith based communities that can practice as they wish and believe what they wish privately. But it's when we're talking about people who are actually engaged in the profession of seeking knowledge and finding out truth that the Constitution of Knowledge upholds. But there's multiple communities that can exist within the United States. But one of the things that I often think about, especially after Trump winning the evangelical vote, is that what happens if a religious faith or a certain religious ideology takes precedence over the general notion of people wanting to observe and recognize the rights of other people. So, for example, on the topic of abortion, for all we know, if it weren't for strongly held religious convictions, for the sake of the argument, let's say that it was strongly held religious convictions that caused abortion to become unpopular and eventually lead to its overturn as Trump realized what his voter base wanted. Um, that's a situation in which the rights of others, I would argue, wouldn't be recognized. And it's predicated on a religious faith that not everyone shares. Not every Christian thinks that abortion is wrong. Not every atheist equally thinks that abortion is perfectly fine. But that decision was influenced by a belief that isn't shared by everyone. And it is a belief that has consequences regarding the rights of other people. So do you feel like there is a noticeable tension there? And even if there is a tension overall, the benefits of having a pluralistic religious society outweigh the negatives?
Yes, there's a tension, and that's the tension that James Madison, in his genius, realized could be harnessed as a creative force for progress. It's also the tension at the core of science. Fundamental disagreement about values and facts is inevitable. There never has been and never will be a country where everyone agrees on facts. And we don't have to. What we do need to agree on generally is the system that we rely on to adjudicate disputes about facts, and that's the constitution of knowledge. But the constitution of knowledge, the whole point of it, okay, so why is Madison, in my opinion, the greatest political genius ever? A bunch of reasons. But number one is that he confronts the hardest problem that a democracy faces. It's the problem of the ambitious demagogue. This is the leader who wants power and uses fear to get it, and who mobilizes prejudice in order to wield his ambition. And Madison says there's only one force that's strong enough to contain ambition in politics. And I ask undergraduates, what is it? And now and then one of them will shout it out. It's ambition. This is the great notion of our founders. If you can harness ambition by pitting ambition against ambition, you can set up a creative process in which different people with different ideas, different factions, different branches of government, different levels of government have to negotiate with each other in a constant, ongoing, rolling negotiation that can push us toward consensus over time and actually force us to adopt creative solutions that are better than what anyone walked in the door with. It's a brilliant, brilliant insight. Fantastically counterintuitive. Okay, constitution of knowledge. Same basic idea. Difference of opinion about everything is absolutely fundamental. Montaigne said that men can't even agree on the color of the sky over their head. How can we ever expect agreement on anything? We're doomed to a world of skeptical collapse where no one will have any knowledge at all. Well, here's what Montaigne didn't understand that subsequent founders of science figured out, which is what is the one force, since we're all biased all the time, none of us is bias free. We all have particular viewpoints. What is the one force that's strong enough to counteract universal bias? And the answer is bias. If you can pit bias against bias, I can't see mine and you can't see yours, but I can see some of yours and you can see some of mine. And if we are forced into contention so that we have to defend our ideas against people with different biases, those biases, instead of becoming the bug, become the feature. Our mistakes and our biases become the raw material from which we can produce knowledge. This is an incredibly counterintuitive and novel idea, but revolutionary in human affairs. This is the reason why we now have a global scientific system and knowledge-producing system that involves hundreds of millions of people and millions of institutions around the world, all harnessed to this single process of searching for each other's mistakes and biases. And that's the reason why it is literally true. I can't prove this, but I'm pretty sure it's literally true that every single day in the modern world before breakfast, humanity creates more new knowledge than in its entire first 200,000 years. That's what we've been able to do with those insights. So the tension is there. Of course it's there. That includes the tension between religion and democracy. The question is, can you put those tensions to creative and constructive use? And that's what we have to try to do and have been amazingly successful at despite the very great difficulties.
Mm-hmm. When you're talking about bias and correcting for your own personal bias with other bias, is that why diversity is so important? Not just diversity in terms of what you look like in your identity, but diversity of thought. Because while I can't see my biases based on where I grew up or what I'm generally used to, someone else might be able to check my bias, and I can check their bias as well. Is that why diversity tends to be a good thing?
Yep, that's exactly it. There are three conditions that the constitution of knowledge needs in order to thrive in a society. The first is freedom of speech and inquiry. And that's something we talk about a lot in the United States. The second we talk about much less, but it's just as important. And that's factfulness. That is disciplining ourselves and each other to stay with the facts and go through all of those processes and procedures to keep us moored to facts, even when we'd rather the facts be different. So I may wish to believe that I won the 2020 election, but that does not free me from the protocols of actually figuring that out and looking at what actually happened, and we know the result. The third condition it needs is viewpoint diversity, and that's for exactly the reason you state. A room full of people who all have the same priors and the same basic beliefs is a room in which everyone shares the same biases, and they will be unable to perceive each other's biases and mistakes, and learning will not take place. Science breaks down where there's too much agreement and not enough viewpoint diversity, and that's become a problem in our universities, unfortunately, and that's why Heterodox Academy and other groups, including a lot of faculty members who've begun to perceive this problem, are working to solve it.
Well, I think this is a good place to start wrapping it up as we're coming up on the hour. Mr. Rauch, it's been absolutely enlightening. Thank you so much for stopping by. It really means a lot. And yeah, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you. It's my privilege.